And finally, I want to talk about identity. Here I'm going to talk about Port Richmond's identity as the Fifth Avenue of Staten Island and also as the Times Square of Staten Island. By 1940, every Staten Islander knew that Port Richmond was the place for shopping, and they flocked to that neighborhood. From small mom and pop stores to five and dimes like Woolworths, to Goldwyn's Jewelers, and to high-end retail stores like Garber Brothers, Port Richmond Avenue was buzzing with commercial activity. Port Richmond was not only the place to go for shopping on Staten Island, but also as a place to see a show. In the late 1920s, Port Richmond had three movie theaters: the Empire, the Palace, and the Ritz. And at these places, at these theaters, you could see vaudeville shows, newsreels, cartoons, double features. At the Ritz, you had the Ritz Orchestra, which would play sometimes in between double features or before a movie. By the late 60s and early 70s, the Ritz hosted concerts by legendary bands like Jefferson Airplane, Jethro Tull, Black Sabbath. So Port Richmond was known as the place to be for shopping as well as for entertainment on Staten Island. So Port Richmond has always been a vibrant community, a vibrant neighborhood, and it's been one of the most, and is one of the most important neighborhoods for the history of Staten Island. Thanks.
Okay, so that's a very quick 10-minute history of Port Richmond. Our book actually emerged from not just a quest to understand the economic and infrastructure of Port Richmond, but more than anything else to understand the ethnic identity of Port Richmond. We were asked by different activists with the local Hispanic community, could we tell a little bit about immigrants that came before? Because one of the things that's very remarkable or has been remarked upon in Port Richmond is the dominance of immigrants. And that seemed to many Staten Islanders to be something very new and foreign. Sometimes even to Americans or New Yorkers, the presence of immigrants seems new and foreign. But what we found in doing this book, even to our own surprise, and even though we knew, for example, that Professor Pappas' Greek grandfather was one of the immigrants who had helped to build Port Richmond, what really struck us in writing this book is that you can't tell the history of Staten Island or Port Richmond, just like you can't tell the history of New York City or America without really talking about the contributions of immigrants. And so that makes the contributions of immigrants today that much more deserving of being appreciated because it's part of a long wave. What we also found is, in addition to the contribution of immigrants and the few people who stood out for helping them, we also found some troubling issues, which I'll get to as we go through the program. Do you want to? Okay, so Professor Pappas gave you a little bit of the history from the very beginning, and I'm going to start mostly in the 1830s, the period of the Irish potato famine. Up until this period, Port Richmond was dominated by various Protestant churches and remained for quite another 100 years pretty much dominated by a variety of Protestant churches of actually multicultural background, Dutch, French, Belgian, and English. So it was a melting pot in Port Richmond and Staten Island from the very earliest days, 1661, 350 years ago, between the Native Americans and the Africans who were here, and these various ethnic groups. Over time, they began to intermarry, the white Protestants, and create very strong religious and power bases in Port Richmond, one of which was the Dutch Reformed Church, and it remained very important for a long time. And its pastor was not just a leader religiously, but also the leader of the educational system in that part of the community, a civic-minded leader, and interestingly enough, born as an immigrant, coming to Port Richmond from Scotland. Can't resist this slide because in his final retirement speech, Brownlee, who actually names Port Richmond, he gives Port Richmond its name because by the time he is at the height of his authority, around the 1860s, Port Richmond becomes an independent community, a township. Only in 1898 does it become part of New York City. And in his retirement speech, he talks about how he watched the cornfields turn into train tracks and industry take over his community. And you can imagine how unsettling it was for many of the Protestant farmers from this community and leaders when it's Irish Catholics and German Catholics coming in with a strange new religion. And so it shouldn't be that hard to understand that the head of the police force and a number of other community leaders, in fact the majority of Port Richmond in 1856 created a party or joined a party called the Know Nothing Party, which was the strongest American anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant party. And they are actually victorious over a very small number of abolitionists who are Republicans and a much larger number of the Irish Democrats who are, the Irish tended to vote like the German Catholics, Democrats. So already in the very early part of its history, the Irish are struggling to be accepted into that community. They build their first church, first outside of the community, and then on the fringe of the community, St. Mary of the Assumption Church. The Irish do remain till today in Port Richmond, but not in the same numbers as some other ethnic groups, and that church is no longer really an Irish parish. Instead, the next couple of waves after the Irish that really sort of settle in and call Port Richmond, sort of take over Port Richmond as a presence, are the Scandinavians. The shipyards that Professor Pappas talked about attract many, many people from Norway, Sweden, from Scandinavia. This is one of the families, this is one of the 4 churches that the Norwegians found, including a Lutheran church, which is right on the park. We're going to talk about later in history. It becomes known as St. Philip's Baptist Church when an African American community take over. There is a very small African American community at this time. But this Norwegian example is very important because this is a family that did chain migration. I don't know if you studied that at all, but in other words, we interviewed this woman's granddaughter. Her grandmother would go back to Norway, convince the neighbors to come stay at her house. Her house would be like a safe haven for new immigrants, and that was part of this chain, bringing Norwegian immigrants to Port Richmond and working in the tens of thousands in the shipyards, building ships for at the time. This is just an example. After consolidation with New York City, one of the ships that's built is the Richmond ferry. The ferry service is taken over by the city, and each borough has a ferry named after it. The Greek immigrants also come to Port Richmond, and this is a great story. I'll just abridge it, but there's many Greeks who settle either in Port Richmond or in the farms just next to it in Bull's Head. There's conflict like in all communities, and they finally put the church in Bull's Head, but again, organizing both their education for their own, to teach their children Greek and the Greek Orthodox religion. Again, a new religion, a new presence in Port Richmond. It's really changing. And this is just a picture of where his store is located on Port Richmond Square. And he talks a lot about how his children, who are still running their candy factory, it's now 100 years old next year, this is where they were located. Jewish immigrants also came. We talked about German Catholics, but there were also German Jews, Austrian Jews, Russian Jews. Some of the most prominent stores on Port Richmond Avenue were owned by Jews, including the Ritz Theater. They would joke that at the high holidays they could have a Port Richmond Board of Trade meeting. Of course, it's not true. There was a very diverse immigrant body running the stores on Port Richmond, but it was one of the things that did come up, and not always positively. So in our research, for example, we found a diary entry. I don't know if you can read it here. It was one of the women who's very involved with the Dutch Reformed Church, complaining about the way the color of this place has changed with all these Jew managers and so on. Mothers' hearts are breaking. So this would be an example of some of the kinds of prejudice that these new immigrants group faced around the turn of the century.